What's going on, everybody, and welcome to a new series that I am kicking off today called the Sundown series. Now, if you were a part of the live stream that I did at the end of 2019, I had made a special announcement in which I said that I was going to kick off a new series, a weekly series talking about sundown towns in America, especially via the United States. And this basically all happened when I got a lot of good reception, I should say, from a sundown town that I did some research on called Vidor, Texas. And then I said, you know what? I wonder if I should turn this into a series. I put it out there in the universe. The universe responded back and said, yes, I should. And this is where we are right now. Now, if you were also on that live stream, I said the first video I was going to do about sundown towns was more so the introduction of what sundown towns are and, the history behind it. So this is just an introduction, the first video, to kind of move people in, because some people out there probably are not familiar with what a sundown town is, because this is something that is also not taught widely in schools, or if a teacher does teach it, they have to go outside of the curriculum to sneak it in there somewhere, and they will give bits and pieces about what a sundown town is. So I'm going to read this article that's going to explain, it pretty much gives like a full breakdown of what a sundown town is. Sundown towns, also known as sunset towns or gray towns, were all white municipalities or neighborhoods in the United States that practice a form of segregation by enforcing restrictions, excluding non-whites via some combination of discriminatory local laws, intimidation, and violence. Entire sundown counties and sundown suburbs were also created by the same process. The term came from the signs posted that colored people had to leave town by sundown. And here's basically one right here where it says whites only within city limits after dark. The practice was not restricted to the southern states as at least until the early 1960s. Northern states could be nearly as inhospitable to black travelers as states like Alabama or Georgia. That goes back to that narrative that even the North was just as racist as the South. Discriminatory policies and actions distinguish sundown towns from towns that have no black residents for demographic reasons. Towns have been confirmed as sundown towns using newspaper articles, county histories, and work progress administration files corroborated by tax or U.S. Census records showing an absence of black people or sharp drop in the black population between two censuses. Following the end of the Reconstruction era, many thousands of towns and counties across the United States became sundown localities as part of the imposition of Jim Crow laws and other racist practices. In most cases, the exclusion was official town policy or was promulgated by the community's real estate agents via exclusionary covenants governing who could buy or rent property. In others, the policy was enforced through intimidation. This intimidation could occur in a number of ways, including harassment by law enforcement officers. Though widely believed to be a thing of the past, many hundreds of sunset towns continue to effectively exclude blacks and other minorities to the present day. In 1844, Oregon banned African Americans from the territory altogether. Those who failed to leave could expect to receive lashings under a law known as the Peter Burnett Lash Law, named for California's first governor, Peter Hardeman Burnett. No persons were ever lashed under the law. It was quickly amended to replace lashing with forced labor and eventually repealed the following year after a change in the makeup of the legislature. However, additional laws aimed at African Americans entering Oregon were ratified in 1849 and 1857, the last of which was not repealed until 1926. So you're hearing this right now, that up until 1926, no black person was even allowed to live in the state of Oregon, the entire state, not just one particular town, but the entire state of Oregon. This law in Oregon was the foreshadowing of future laws restricting where minorities could live, not only in Oregon, but other jurisdictions. Outside Oregon, other places looked to law, in other legislations to help restrict blacks from residing within cities, towns, and states. One example is Louisville, Kentucky, whose mayor proposed a law in 1911 that would restrict blacks from owning property in different parts of the city. This city ordinance reached public attention when it was challenged in the U.S. Supreme Court case Buchanan versus Worley in 1917. Ultimately, the court decided that the laws passed in Louisville were unconstitutional, thus setting the legal precedent that similar laws could not exist or be passed in the future. This one legal victory did not stop towns from developing into sundown towns. City planners and real estate companies used their powers and authority to ensure that white communities remain white and black communities remain black. These were private individuals making decisions to personally benefit themselves, their company profits, or their city's alleged safety, so their methods in creating sundown towns were often ignored by the courts. In addition to unfair housing rules, citizens turned to violence and harassment in making sure blacks would not remain in their cities after sundown. Whites in the North felt that their way of life was threatened by the increased minority populations moving into their neighborhoods, and racial tension started to build. This often boiled over into violence, sometimes extreme, such as the 1943 Detroit race riot. Since the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, and especially since the Fair Housing Act of the 1968, prohibition of racial discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of housing, the number of sundown towns has decreased. However, as sociologist James W. Lohman writes in his book Sundown Towns, A Hidden Dimension of American Racism, that came out in 2005, it is impossible to precisely count the number of sundown towns at any given time because most towns have not kept records of the ordinances or signs that mark the town's sundown status. He further notes that hundreds of cities across America have been sundown towns at some point in their history. Additionally, Lohman writes that sundown status meant more than just that African Americans were unable to live in these towns. Any blacks who entered or were found in sundown towns after sunset were subjected to harassment, threats, and violence, including lynching. The Supreme Court case Brown versus Board of Education ruled segregation of schools unconstitutional in 1954. Lohman argues that the case caused some municipalities in the South to become sundown towns. Missouri, Tennessee, and Kentucky saw drastic drops in African American populations living in the states following the decision. Many suburban areas in the United States were incorporated following the establishment of Jim Crow laws. The majority of suburbs were made up of all white residents from the time they were first created. Harassment and inducements helped to keep African Americans out of new suburban areas. Schoolings also played a large role in keeping the suburbs white. The suburbs often did not provide school for blacks, causing black families to send their schools to school in large municipalities such as Atlanta, Georgia. Now, isn't that a full circling, since Atlanta, Georgia has a large black population today? African Americans were forced to pay a fee to Central Municipality in order for their children to attend school there. Despite the fee, however, they were not provided with transportation to school in the city. The education barrier to African Americans in the suburbs caused many to migrate to cities across the United States. In addition to these educational barriers, home developers in the 1950s built an all-white subdivision, pushing more African Americans out of the suburbs. Now, hear that right there. Now, what's going on right now? Gentrification, where you are having a lot of white people now wanting to move from the suburbs back into the city where a lot of black people are, and pushing the black people back out to the suburbs where black people at one time were trying to get to, but it was in reverse and they were pushing them in more into the city, or what they call inner city. So it's amazing how all of this stuff came full circle. Basically, it's like I always said, it's like white flight in reverse. Now it's pretty much, it went 180. Now it's doing like a complete 360. The African Americans who lived in suburban areas were janitors, cooks, gardeners for white families, and the few African Americans who lived in the suburbs occupied their own working class sections of the neighborhoods. Towns with interracial populations such as Chamblee, Georgia, and Pearl, Mississippi, forced their African Americans to leave town as they developed into the suburbs. Wow. So that right there was the introduction to the Sundown Town series. I just wanted to give you an overview of what sundown towns were, a history, some examples. And yes, sundown towns to this day even still exist, as you will find as we go forward and continue on with this series. This is going to be very interesting. I have not done a series of videos in probably over a year now. I did the Black Heroes Month, I did the White History Month, but that was just conducive to a month. So the challenge now is doing a series that's weekly that goes on for over a year. And I say over a year because when I was doing my research on different sundown towns, I found, I went back and counted, it's like 120 of them I found. So I have enough towns to go through probably almost 2 years. So we're going to be here for a while. But y'all let me know what you think. This was the introduction for the Sundown series, and I will talk to you in the next one.